Hey guys, alright, today we are watching What If John F. Kennedy Was Never Assassinated by Alternate History Hub. Now this one should be pretty interesting. I think this is, aside from Germany winning World War II and World War I, I think this is probably the number three top what if scenario. At least among Americans. I don't know. Probably not the rest of the world, obviously, because he's an American president. Maybe some Russians, possibly. Just because of, well, Russian and American relations at the time of his presidency. But yeah, let's go ahead and watch this. I personally think that it probably would have been maybe a little bit better. I think he probably would have been a better, I think he was definitely better than LBJ. LBJ was okay. I think I put LBJ at like C tier in a video I did like a while ago now, where I did a tier list of the United States presidents up until I think Gerald Ford. Or did I go to Carter? I can't remember now. But I think JFK had a lot of potential. He was a great public speaker. I think he had some pretty good ideas, but it really all depends on if he would have still been able to implement them, even if he did not die. So yeah, let's go ahead and watch and see what Alternate History Hub has to say about this alternate timeline.
President John F. Kennedy is one of the most famous presidents in United States history. He was young and charismatic.
Yeah.
And while JFK was quite a special figure in American politics, he was far more famous in death. The story of this man struck down so sudden in a public setting both horrified and captivated the world. Lots of people now ask the question, one that I'll try to answer as well. What if JFK was never assassinated? What if he continued to be president throughout most of the 1960s? What would be the effects on American society and maybe even the world? Looking back on the events of his presidency and historical facts, I'll try to predict how this alternate timeline may look if JFK indeed survived. When people imagine a world where JFK lived, it's basically a world where Lyndon Johnson was not president. When Kennedy was killed, LBJ was put into the presidency. While both shared similar domestic views, their qualities as politicians would create much different results for the US. So in this scenario, the most...
Yeah, I think that's a very important line there. Their qualities as a politician. JFK, and honestly, kind of the whole Kennedy family, they are, for the most part, fairly skilled, extremely skilled politicians. And I think JFK is obviously the most famous of the Kennedys, and probably the most skilled politician that they've had. But yeah, obviously there was I can't remember the Kennedy's name, but he was killed in, I think prior to the 1968 election, because he was running on the Democratic ticket, and then he got killed. He was murdered. That's another interesting alternate scenario I'd like to see someone do, is explore what if the Kennedy that was killed in 1968, like I guess won the Democratic ticket and was up against Nixon. Yeah, I that would have been interesting to see. But yeah, let's get back to this one.
Accurate thing to do is ask what Kennedy could have done differently that Johnson wouldn't have, while also looking at the significance Johnson played to shape America today. The 1960s was dominated with racial violence and the rapid growth of the civil rights movement. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. had been advocating for an end to segregation and other unfair practices since the 1950s. JFK sympathized with the struggle of the black population, even calling the wife of MLK after his arrest and then pressuring for his release. However, Kennedy was never truly vocal about it until the last few months of his presidency. Why was this? He was worried about losing the support of white Southern Democrats, focused on...
Yes. And I'm glad he's putting this up, 50 years ago, except some towns in certain parts of America still have this kind of feeling. Oh, I just
on the
noticed
upcoming
certain word that's
1964
up here.
election.
Oof.
When he did eventually
Oof.
speak up for civil rights, he argued the debate as a moral one, stressing that if America truly was free, we would treat every American as equal.
Yep,
Public
as
segregation
you
was
should.
still in effect across the United States. 10 years after,
Wait, are they also... Were black Americans charged more? Is that what I'm seeing there on the Dr. Pepper thing? 10 cents? Not saying for the whites. That's... God. I mean, I know we've got it. Racial issues are still very prevalent in America and in the world society today. But, gotta admit, we have come pretty far. Now, there are certain things, obviously, you can argue that certain things maybe have not advanced in terms of getting to the equality that should exist in the world. But, damn.
Brown versus Board of Education banned it in public schools. Whites from both the North and South didn't want to integrate. His legislation, the Civil Rights Act, was not only to ban segregation in public, but to use the federal government to protect the rights of all races, genders, etc. However, he never got to see his bill pass, as he was killed while he was in committee. It wasn't until LBJ's presidency the following year where the bill was finally passed. So in this alternate timeline where JFK never dies, what happens? The civil rights movement might have actually been set back. Why is this? JFK's relationship with Congress was rough to begin with. He beat out Nixon by the slimmest of margins in the election. He hardly related to the aging Congress, and by his death, his Civil Rights Act was in limbo in the Rules Committee, where it was basically held hostage, planned to never move forward. However, Kennedy's death changed all that. It removed a Northern Democrat from the office and replaced him with a Southern Democrat, LBJ. This fundamental shift, ironically, saved Kennedy's bill. Johnson carried the torch left by Kennedy, and he was much more vocal about minority rights than even JFK was. He didn't care about stepping on toes to do it. Just 5 days after JFK's death, LBJ rallied for the passing of the...
Maybe I put LBJ a bit low on my list than I should have a couple months ago.
Civil Rights Act, saying that by not doing so would disrespect Kennedy's memory. LBJ had one thing Kennedy didn't: influence. He had history inside Congress and knew how it worked. He navigated around the tricks they would use. He used his famous Johnson treatment, standing over to convince or straight up intimidate to get those on his side, even telling one opponent of the bill, "If you get in the way, I'm going to run you down." And even after all the political games, navigations, and techniques by the Johnson administration, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 barely passed after 83 days of filibuster. In this alternate timeline, Kennedy would not have the
Who would deny the civil... What's wrong with you people? God.
Political influence or power to push such a bill through. It took all the skill of a well-connected Southern Democrat to pass it. A disliked Northerner wouldn't have had a chance. The act would have either taken much longer, died while in committee, or be considerably weaker than in our timeline. Because of this, MLK and other civil rights leaders would still rally for reform against segregation. Without the federal power to force the states to stop Jim Crow laws, protests and racial violence would be more drawn out. We would see more police crackdown, firebombings, assassinations, basically just a bloodier path for ending segregation that would have been passed quicker in our timeline. In this alternate timeline, without the Civil Rights Act, bills like the Voting Rights Act and Title IX would arrive later than in our timeline. They would still occur, however, if Kennedy was still alive, the civil rights movement would have taken a step back simply because JFK didn't have the influence Johnson had. Speaking of Johnson's influence in Congress, LBJ's presidency brought on a lot of immense change to the United States. He used the same
But couldn't... And to kind of push back against Alternate History Hub here, couldn't the president then just, have his vice president LBJ use his influence to get the president's bill passed through? Like work together as president and vice president, should? Unless JFK was so much about doing everything himself or something.
Tactics for his new legislation reforms, declaring a war on poverty, and creating programs for his Great Society, very similar to FDR with the New Deal. Johnson's administration directly led to Medicaid, Medicare, PBS, expanded Social Security, created the National Endowment of the Arts, and numerous...
Let's be real here. PBS is pretty dope.
Conservation and housing projects. In this alternate timeline, Kennedy would call for a war on poverty as well. He planned to do the same efforts as Johnson once he was re-elected. Johnson's policies were actually just continued plans of JFK's. However, Kennedy never would have expanded his reforms as drastically as LBJ had. Kennedy would have easily defeated the Republican Barry Goldwater in the 1964 election. This is without a doubt. Goldwater's Cold War attitude scared many in the US, and in our timeline, it led Johnson to win in one of the most lopsided victories in United States history. Kennedy would have won as well, and stayed president until 1968. You can't talk about JFK without how he would have handled Vietnam. Would the war have even happened? Or would he have fell into the same trap Johnson did and sent American troops into Southeast Asia? Well, let's look at Kennedy's mindset during the presidency. Kennedy never wanted to get into Vietnam. He never wanted to involve American troops in a direct war against the North. But JFK wasn't a pushover either. He was a hardline anti-communist, but a realist in return. He knew not every situation resulted in an American victory, but would go through the best efforts to prevent communist expansion in the process. It cannot be understated how much Kennedy distrusted his military advisors. He often went against their opinions, aiming for more peaceful routes. This can be seen in Laos and Cuba, where he didn't escalate the situation to war. Each time JFK did his own thing. In this alternate timeline, since John F. Kennedy lives to face the greater challenge of Vietnam, the US never gets itself completely involved in the war. JFK distrusted his generals and their over-optimism in conflict. He saw the dangers such a political quagmire would bring. Kennedy tried his hardest to downplay the situation in Vietnam. He knew that the public would quickly call for a war if the communists got the upper hand. He was right. Today we forget how fast Americans rallied for war in Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, the document that started American involvement, passed overwhelmingly in Congress. Good thing we don't have that rash thinking anymore.
I can't even respond because it's so on the nose. It's so perfect.
It just wasn't in Kennedy's personality as a leader to escalate the situation so far that Lyndon Johnson did. Of course, he was a believer in the domino theory and saw the threat North Vietnam posed, but if the war still came, it would have been different. The massive bombing runs, search and destroy, body counts, that was Johnson's solution, not Kennedy's. Even with full American effort to deter North Vietnam, the South would have fell anyway. JFK would have been the president that lost South Vietnam. I imagine in this alternate timeline, it would be a hot debate today whether America should have gotten involved. From a simple human cost, over 60,000 American soldiers and countless Vietnamese don't die in the fighting. Of course, considerable Vietnamese still die, but not at the level as in our timeline. Without the Vietnam War, the relationship between US citizens and the government is different. The images that they saw every night were not supporting the story of a successful war the Johnson administration boasted. The hippie movement, or more accurately counterculture of the 1960s, would still have existed. Counterculture was created by many different factors, from civil rights, feminism, to simple rebellion against the Leave It to Beaver family of the 1950s. Sorry, Nixon, hippies still would have existed. However, the anti-war movement against Vietnam expanded counterculture to college kids and young people, those personally affected by the draft. Without the war, this counterculture would have taken much longer to appear in American society. In this alternate timeline, it's likely Johnson and Nixon would both run for the presidency. However, it's difficult to predict who would win. Much of the scenario becomes extremely complex, too much for the size of this video. I'll leave the rest to your imagination. Why was Kennedy so significant? He only served around 2 years in office. How did he leave such a lasting impact? I believe it was because Kennedy embodied the hopeful future of America.
Yes.
Resilient, clever. His dream was America's dream, but his sudden tragic end put an end to that and brought on the reality. Following JFK's death, there was certainly a change. The race riots, culture shift, Americans bogged down overseas. The 60s and 70s were tough decades for the United States, and so looking back, it's not difficult to see JFK as that last glimmering hope of what could have been. There certainly was lots of progress after his death, but there was also certainly lots of distrust, tension, and rebellion as well. Maybe things would have been different had JFK lived. We'll never truly know. This is just one scenario out of the countless possibilities. Like on Facebook and subscribe.
Good video. Yeah. All right. So let's see if I can expand a little bit more. All right. So going off of his timeline here, JFK in Vietnam. Gosh, I don't know. That's where it definitely does get muddy, where we don't really know what he would do. Would the Gulf of Tonkin have happened under JFK? Now, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, I think we can assume it was probably a setup by the American government in order to justify passing a Tonkin resolution in order to get involved into the conflict of Vietnam. Would that have happened under JFK? Probably because of... Probably would have happened differently because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Probably would have wanted to avoid something like that. I think his support would have been more in terms of guns and food. I think definitely he would have sent less troops. Far, far less troops. I don't think he... Honestly, I think I leaned more towards he probably would not have sent any troops. I think it would have solely been equipment and food. Maybe military advisors. You know what? No, scratch it. I think he would probably send troops to the capital at least. Probably towards the latter end of the war. But yeah, definitely far less Vietnamese casualties. And would he have napalmed? I think because he cared so much for his public image, I don't think he would have risked napalming Vietnam. So I don't think Agent Orange, as I think it's called, would have occurred. At least in the way that it did in our timeline. But yeah, I'm going to end it there. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Don't forget to leave a suggestion down below as to what you'd like to see me react to next. And as always, have a good day. Thank you.